Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the International Peace Institute. I am Maureen Quinn, Director of Programs. Tonight, the International Peace Institute, the International Civil Society Action Network, and the Mission of Norway are pleased to co-host Vision and Voice, What the Women Say, a panel discussion on the report from ICAN's, that's the International Civil Society Action Network's acronym, on ICAN's Women's Rights, Peace and Security Forum, which was held last September in Istanbul. We had hoped to discuss the results of that forum last October during Superstorm Sandy, but like everything else in New York, we shut down during that week. So we have some I'll call it some active weather out there tonight to remind us of that time. Today's event is the third event in the International Peace Institute's series on women, peace, and security, which is a collaborative effort to highlight women advancing peace processes and political transitions. And so today, we have this opportunity, given that the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia are going through this period of profound change. And this gives us the opportunity to discuss women who are at the front lines of this change. So it's my pleasure. I'm going to start by introducing our panelists. We're going to do tonight's program a little bit differently from what we usually do at IPI, and I'll explain that as we go along. So I'm going to start with Sanam Anderlini, who's one of our co-hosts, and actually she is the co-founder and executive director of the International Civil Society Action Network. She is also a senior fellow at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Center for International Studies. She was a leading civil society drafter of UN Security Council resolutions on women, peace, and security, and has initiated groundbreaking research on women's contributions to peace processes. She has also served as an advisor and consultant to various UN bodies on these issues globally. So Sanam, thank you, and thank you to ICAN for co-hosting. Norway, our other co-host, is represented tonight by Arvinn Gadgil, the State Secretary of International Development in the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Gadgil has served as State Secretary since April of last year. Previously, he was political advisor to the Minister of Development. Before that, personal assistant to the political director in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He has worked in the Afghanistan and South Asia section of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. State Secretary Gadgil is a member of the Social Left Party. So, Mr. Minister, thank you as well for being here and also for co-hosting. From the participants of the ICAN Forum of last September on women's rights, peace, and security, I'm delighted to introduce our three panelists. So we have Dr. Rita Sabat from Lebanon. She's an assistant professor at the Notre University Loisy in the Faculty of Political Science, Public Administration, and Diplomacy. Rita teaches courses in the areas of international institutions, gender, non-government organizations, and development. She also serves as a member of Lebanon's Technical Task Force of the National Gender-Based Violence Unit in the Ministry of Social Affairs. From Iran, our panelist is Parisa Kakaee. Parisa studied clinical psychology in Iran and worked with different NGOs focusing on women's rights and children's rights. She left Iran in 2010 and is now pursuing a master's degree in childhood studies and children's rights at the Free University of Berlin. She continues to work as a freelance writer on the issue of children's rights and women's rights with various Iranian websites. We are also very pleased to have Visaka Dharmadasa from Sri Lanka with us. Visaka is the founder and chair of the Association of War-Affected Women and Parents of Servicemen Missing in Action in Sri Lanka. Ms. Dharmadasa has educated soldiers and community leaders about the international standards of the conduct of war. Visaka was awarded the prestigious Humanitarian Award in 2006 from Interaction in Washington, D.C. So welcome to all of you. Now, our objective tonight is really to have a conversation, a dialogue, with our panelists, among our panelists, and with all of you in the audience, particularly on these issues in the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia at this time of historic political transitions. And we especially want to hear and discuss the results of last September's forum and its conclusions, which include constructive, pragmatic, and an inclusive vision of the future. Now, for those of you who attend IPI's events regularly, what we normally do is have each panelist speak. But tonight we're going to do things a little bit differently. We're still webcasting live. We ask you to turn your cell phones off, but you can put, just not off, just put them on vibrate. You can tweet if you want. But what we're going to do instead of the normal presentation is I'm going to interview our panelists. I'm going to ask them one or two specific questions. Then we're going to give them a little bit of opportunity if they want to comment or say anything about, to have a conversation among the panel. We'll open it up then, obviously, for discussion, questions and answers with all of you. And then when we're winding down our conversation, we're going to give each of the panelists that opportunity to make very brief, I'll call it concluding remarks, very brief, any other thoughts that they want to say at the end of our discussion. In addition, we wanted this event to be a networking event as well, because this is the week of the Commission on Status of Women, and we know that there are experts and people from all over the world. So our objective is to keep the conversation going after our formal discussion. And so we really appreciate you all being here and to be a part of this discussion. So with that, we will begin. So to start our dialogue, I'm going to turn to Sanam, and I'm going to ask you, you took the initiative, you and ICAN took the initiative of convening this first regional forum on the Middle East and South Asia, and you produced a report. And by the way, the report is available by the door for those of you who are interested in reading more in detail. Now, the report highlights that women, obviously we all know, women were at the forefront of these political changes in the Middle East. They were at the front lines during the Arab awakening, what's called the Arab Spring, across the Middle East in 2011. Yet, as the political transitions have evolved, women's voices have seemingly been ignored, or as your report states, Sanam, societies are witnessing the history of women's progress and achievements being erased. So I would ask you to start to talk a little bit about what are the factors, the indigenous anchors, I think as it's talked about in your report, of women's rights in the region, and then as you noted in your report, how these are being ignored or whitewashed out of the picture. So thank you.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to see everybody here. I know many of you have had a tough week. It's been very busy, and God knows what's going on across the road, or has been going on across the road. But I'm delighted that you're here, and that with the help of IPI and the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we've been able to host this event and feed you and give you drinks as well, which is very nice. So thank you so much for that. I also very specifically wanted to thank Norway, not only for their financial support to many of us in the room for the work that we do, but also for the values that they constantly uphold at the international level. It makes an enormous difference, I think, to have some of the countries around us. It doesn't matter how small or big, but to have the values. So thank you very much for being here with us. So going back to your question, so what as we said, we had women from 12 countries in the region together in Istanbul with us in September of last year, and we will do this again every year for the foreseeable future, and we hope to make it a bigger forum for networking. The issues that came up very resoundingly across the region were that women have not only been active, but they were often the first ones out on the streets in Libya and other places. And this is something that we seem to forget, that we kind of erase out of our history. Demanding rights, having a space for voice, having a space for dignity, and so forth. But what they're experiencing is that a politicized Islam, and I don't want to say that this is Islam as many of us know it, but the politicization of Islam and the types of groups that we're seeing emerging are targeting women very directly. This is not, as in many other places, we've seen women being the conduit for addressing ethnic communities or religious communities. In our region, women are the target. And that this is something that we have to really understand. So the nexus between what happens to women and women's rights and the peace and security and democracy agenda are totally interwoven together. Now, one of the things that we've seen is that there is a version of Islamic values, if you want, or Islamic behavior that is being introduced into many of the countries like Tunisia, Egypt, and so forth, that to many of the activists that are working there are actually completely alien. So we had Tunisians saying, these Salafists, who are they? Where were they? They weren't with us on the streets. This is more alien to us than many other things. So it's something that's spreading across the region. It is a Wahhabi Salafi version of Islam. It's being supported in one way or another from from countries in the region, and we have to recognize this and call it what it is. And as civil society, I'm allowed to do that, so I'm going to put it out on the table for further discussion. And it's being funded very much so. So that's something that's important. And they're trying to change the narrative. They're trying to say that women's rights is a Western concept. It's an alien concept. Whereas if you look at it, and we've put our reports out, if you look at Egypt, there was a women's rights movement from the 1800s. In Tunisia, in many of these places. So you have this history that exists, and then this erasure that's coming, which is extraordinary. So that's something that we have to be aware of. And there's a real double standards, because they're quite happy to take the cell phones and the weapons and the Viagra that the West provides, and the money. But when it comes to support for civil society, all of a sudden, oh, this is Western money, it's tainted. So that there is this notion that we have to be, I think, be very, very careful about. The reason why I think we see this rise is in part because these are movements and groups that were on the ground, were in the grassroots, providing social services, having connections with people. And this is, I think, part of the challenge that we have, that the states that were supported in the past, again, by Western governments also, did not provide those services. So let's be clear about where the fault lines lie and who is doing what. But these are important things. Now, the other side of the story, I think, is what we've seen from the international community's responses over the last 2 years. As an Iranian who's grown up in England and lived here and so forth, I find it extraordinary, because I'm often told, these are conservative societies, and I'm thinking, who are you to tell me what my society is and where we come from and what our history is? But there is an Orientalist approach that's very culturally relativistic about women in our region. And it's fed by an ignorance on the part of many policymakers and media and others here in terms of not knowing the history of women in Egypt or the history of women in Tunisia and so forth. So that's one thing, that's one aspect of it. And then there's a confusion that's happening, which is that we are assuming that politicized Islam, or the use of Islam for political end, is the same as being a good Muslim. In our forum, we had women who are covered from headscarves all the way to the chador, practicing and so forth, and yet they embrace and they work for women's rights based on universal norms. And that's a very different story to having political parties that are using this for their own means and ends. And I think that's an important distinction to make. Another thing that we're seeing is that whereas in the international community and in the international discourse, we separate the social from the political and the security, if you want. Women, we're always social. We're not political. We're always in the social realm somehow. In the forces that we're seeing coming up, women are really, really important. What happens to women, as I said, it's part of the political ideology. It's not by mistake that the first speech by the Libyan Transitional Authority said polygamy will now be permitted. We should see that as an early warning indicator of what's coming forward. So that this is something that they see it as completely interwoven. Another thing that we're seeing is that we are falling into, or Western countries are falling into the narrative of our values and their values. Very often I hear Western folks saying, our values are different. And we sit there and we're saying, women are dying on the streets of these countries. Women are being raped on the streets of Egypt for human rights. How dare you say that these are your values and our values? So we have to say these are universal values for which we're fighting for. And not only they're universal values, let's remember that across the street there's a replica of something called the Cyrus Cylinder, which is the first declaration of human rights, which comes from our region, and it's 2,500 years old. So let's reclaim and put back human rights into universal human rights back into our region, and not fall into the narrative that we have. And then the final point I just want to make in terms of the connection to the women, peace, and security agenda was that, as I said, very often we like to see women separated from the peace and security or political and security issues. And the whole rationale and the raison d'etre for the women, peace, and security agenda that we now have, the Resolution 1325 and all the rest of it, was that women have been saying, we have something to say, we have a right to be there, we have something to do. These peace and security discussions matter to us. And we see the interconnectedness. And at the international level, we're also seeing this sort of parallel universe again emerging. We have many countries telling us we have national action plans, we support women's rights, we think it's fantastic, yay, let's go with 1325 and all the rest of it. And yet at the same time imposing sanctions on countries in the region, including Iran, where those sanctions are directly hurting women and women's rights and promoting the abuse of human rights on a massive scale. So the people on the ground see the connection. The people on the ground see the connection between militarization and the spread of weapons and what's going on with women. And so I think we have to look at ourselves at the international level and say, the whole point of this agenda was to make these connections and to transform the way we think about security, to bring the voices of women, which is, by the way, very much a human security-oriented approach. So these are the sort of shortcomings at the international level in terms of the responses to women on the ground. And I feel what I'm worried about, and we have the sort of series of sort of key themes that emerge, and then the kind of support that's needed. But I'm very concerned that we're still at the point where we somehow don't understand that when half the population is being threatened, this is really a threat to peace and security. We're still seeing it as this is something cultural happening. If this half of the population were an ethnic group, the blue people, we would say this is racism. If it was, a religious group, we would say this is discrimination. When it's women, we don't do it, and it's really time to do it because this is a harbinger of some very dangerous things to come forward. And the women are there fighting the fight at the front lines. They're doing it for us right now. The least that we can do is be there in support of them and upholding their voice, including across the street over the next 2 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanam, and thank you particularly for the overview, the historical perspective, and the connection to the work that is going on here at the United Nations. Now we're going to zoom in a little bit in some ways. I'm going to turn to Rita, Dr. Rita Sabat from Lebanon, and go a little bit more specific. So I'm turning to you, Rita, because this year's theme of the Commission on the Status of Women is the prevention of violence against women. So I wanted to ask you, Rita, given your experience and your role on the technical task force on gender-based violence at the Ministry of Social Affairs in Lebanon, I'd appreciate your perspectives on the challenges in Lebanon today related to gender-based violence. But in addition as well, if you could comment about how that issue in relation, especially given the influx of Syrian refugees. So thank you.
First, how do you follow that? Thank you so much, Sanam. She really set up the framework. I want to kind of before I delve into the great work that's been done on trying to combat violence against women in Lebanon that's been taking place since the 90s, I want to kind of reiterate this message, and that actually Lebanon has a very specific role and message to play at the national, regional, and international levels in addressing the women, peace and security agenda and the struggle to challenge and face this increasing phenomena and growing problem of gender-based violence, which is a the core of this discourse, right? The second real argument that I wanted to put out there is that, and it builds upon other scholars' arguments as well as people that have been researching conflict situations and gender-based violence, is that we really need to make this tie between gender inequality and state and international insecurity and instability. It is important that we know that there are people that have been out there researching, examining. The larger the gap between gender inequality, the higher the chances for state insecurity and international security. And that connection needs to be made at a local level, at a regional level, and at an international level. So in my discussion, I'll try to kind of piece that together and show you how that kind of works in Lebanon's situation. First of all, there's an existence and a growth in gender-based violence, whether structural or direct, and it's at the heart and the future of stability and instability. And that this is fueled by structures and systems that continue to allow this culture of violence to ferment. I want to say up front, I'm not saying that we eliminate the systems or the structures that are in place, but that we realize that these structures are embedded and they are creating this inequality that is fueling the violence. So that's the introductory part. To get back to the more positive and the successes that we have had with the Ministry of Social Affairs, driven by civil society and non-governmental organizations that have actually, paved the way to discussing gender-based violence in Lebanon that maybe 20 years ago had never been even a question to be talked about outside of our homes. We, as a technical task force, which I play a very minimal role, I can't take the credit for it. Abad Resource Center for Gender Equality and its director, the Ministry of Social Affairs and the International Medical Corps are the leaders in this. They've produced practical approaches. They've developed a manual for addressing gender-based violence that includes guidelines for doctors, social workers, non-governmental organizations that are working on prevention, protection, and documentation for prosecution of gender-based violence. These are very important steps in our struggle to eliminate violence against women in Lebanon. However, that still is missing the link between that and the link to state security and the enforcement of that and introduction of new laws that will support that base, that grassroots base. So I think that missing link can be seen and is contributing to this instability that we're finding in the country and in the region because of some of the systems that are in place, the structural systems that are in place. And these are not only the concern for Lebanese women alone, it's a concern for the Palestinian and Syrian women who are the largest population of refugees that are living in Lebanon today, and for others like the domestic workers that we have living in Lebanon and etc., displaced populations. For years, researchers have highlighted that the patriarchal kinship, confessional, gender, class, and age hierarchy that is embedded in our communities create inequality between men and women, as well as between women in our community. This inequality clearly is rooted and tied to the cause of gender-based violence. It's known that inequality feeds violence. It feeds the space to create or to have an existence violence. One of the main structures that I talk about is the personal status codes. And that's why I prefaced that I'm not talking about eliminating but recognizing the difficulties of personal status codes, because the personal status codes regulate men and women's lives. They have a direct connection to confessional leaders, who confessional leaders have a direct relationship to the proportional confessional political representation that is available in our country. This connection has increased or has led to increased instability and violence in Lebanon and across the region. The irony is that the agenda of personal status codes is the regulation and control of women and the spaces that they occupy. For example, to make it more concrete, there's an organization that has been working on developing a family violence law for over 3 years. They negotiated with parliamentarians, they negotiated with religious leaders, and they presented it to the parliament. Once it was presented to the parliament, religious leaders came out in objection to the family violence bill and said that they would be the first to object and that it's their constitutional right to actually object and prevent the law from passing into penal code, because it is written in the Constitution that this is their domain. This law was referred to parliamentarian committee. They reviewed, they amended some articles, but they removed the spirit of the law in direct violation of what was an attempt by civil society to pass something that would provide protection. The second example and it's a more recent example that's been in the news, is the civil society's attempt to circumvent the system and pass what they called the first civil marriage in Lebanon. The young couple decided that with the civil society actors, that they were gonna have the first civil marriage in Lebanon. There's no civil marriage law in Lebanon. So the way that they did that was that if they removed their personal status of their family registration identity, there is a way to register it through the Constitution. It's constitutional, and it will go into law as a contract that they had designed themselves. They wrote the contract and they did that, and then all of a sudden it went viral. It was on Facebook, it was in the news. And once again, the religious leaders came out and said, absolutely not. And they actually went as far as threatening politicians and telling them, if you discuss this issue in parliament, if you dare to address creating a civil marriage law, you will be stripped of your right to your right to religion and the rights that are propagated for you in religion. So these are, for me, vivid examples of the connection between the personal and the political, with women at the heart of this discourse and security of the people. This is not exclusive to Lebanon. And it's a regional problem because it's been discussed by women's movement for over 20 years. CEDAW, which has 2 main reservations in the region across states, with Article 16, which is the personal status codes. This is what the discussion has been, and most states have refused or have been unable to come to a solution to remove this reservation, because it's intricately tied to the way we live in our communities. That's why I say I'm not saying do away with the system, because we are tied. We are from those communities. We live by the principles and the values of those communities. But the structures and the laws that make us unequal against each other make it much more difficult. So the link to state security or insecurity becomes more apparent once you start to see the spaces that allow for discrimination between individuals that can turn violent in one way or another. And this cannot be ignored by the international community that is across the region, like Sanam is saying today, coming in, and you have new transitional governments that are trying to rebuild nations and ensure that they place their values, or that they do not they do not actually conflict or contradict with their norms. That there are some some kind of warning signs, red flags. Most of you might at this point be saying, what can we do about this? So what's the answer? What do you envision? Well, first, I envision that the international community and member states really highlight the inclusion of women, peace, and security as a foreign policy objective. It has never been a foreign policy objective in bilateral negotiations and meetings or multilateral negotiations. So this is one of the ways to actually ensure that women's rights and equality is not negotiated away at the expense of instead of interest. And to use this objective to rally transnational support and pressure to address, incorporate, and challenge member states to live up to their Security Council commitments, 1325, etc., etc. It's important that member states really understand that this support for parties or movements at the expense of women's security will only enable instability and the likelihood of future conflict nationally, regionally, and eventually internationally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rita, and particularly with the focus on the issue of gender-based violence. So now, Parisa, I'd like to turn to you, and we're very pleased that you have joined us tonight to talk about the situation in Iran, and I'm going to ask you about women's political participation in Iran. So women were actively involved in the Green Movement that emerged around the June 2009 presidential elections in Iran. What are those women doing today to have their voices heard?
Do you hear me? Okay, yes. At first, I want to thank you for having me here. I don't have so much experience in speaking for lots of people in English language, so excuse me for my mistakes. At first, I would like to give you some backgrounds on the situation of women's movement in Iran. Before 2005 and the election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, which marked the start of a conservative era, Iranian activists had more opportunity to work on national, social, and political issues. We had more chance to write about these issues in newspapers and journals. We had many weblogs and websites which were working on the women's rights issues. So there were some successful progresses on rising social awareness about women's rights. But after 2005, everything changed, and the chance to work on social and political issues was significantly reduced. Surprisingly, this was also the time that women's movement became more active. Most of these activities were a result of the open space it experienced during the reform period, but some of it was in resistance to security pressures and the closing of social space. In this difficult situation, all the groups in the women's movement tried to find a way to work and establish relations with the society. Many activists faced threat of prosecution and jail. Some of them were arrested, but they continued with their programs and managed to raise awareness about gender issues in the society. After 2009 and the disputed presidential elections in Iran, everything got worse, such as the situation of activists in the society. Some activists left the country and some others are in prison. Now Iran is facing a very complicated and difficult situation. Society is oppressed by both domestic government and international community. But even in this situation, activists are trying to do their best. For example, to increase the awareness of society about violence, they wore makeup to look like they were battered and went to the streets and used the opportunity to speak with people about violence, or to protest over some governmental legislation against women. They wrote petitions, collected signatures, and went to the parliaments to speak to MPs. All these activities have been done in an insecure atmosphere in which they may be arrested and sentenced to prison for a long time. But they continue with their work even if at a much more limited level.
So thank you, Parisa. Could you talk a little bit about the impact of sanctions on the women's movement in Iran? Thank you.
Yes. Actually, in these days, we face more problems regarding women's situation. Some of them are old, and the old issues, and others are new, caused by complicated economic and political situation of Iran. Existing news and activist reports shows the increase of child marriage, unemployed women, unequal wages, prostitution, discriminatory laws against women, and restriction of personal freedom, and education, and also economic problems. Also, since there is not any sufficient statistics, we don't know how many girls are trapped by human trafficking networks, and how many are engaged in different types of sexual exploitation of children. To make matters worse, Iran is faced with increasing isolation as a result of sanctions. This means that Iranian people and civil society are also under pressure. In addition to poor economic policies and economic mismanagement, the main factor which complicates the situation in Iran is sanctions. In fact, the policy of West affects all people and civil society. To explain the situation, I discuss some of these effects. First of all, people are more engaged in fulfilling their basic needs. They are depressed and scared. In the society which people are scared of poverty, the standards of personal morality decline and violence increase. The question is, who are the main victims of violence? Statistics and international experiences indicate that women and children are the main victims of violence. So, sanctions cause insecurity for women in the society. Second, this violence is not just in the society. Domestic violence is another problem which is caused by sanctions. Sanctions make the economic situation worse. When the percentage of unemployment increases, women get fired from their work, or they have to work with minimum wages. In the male-dominated culture of Iranian society, this is the best opportunity to keep women at home as mother and wife, and finally exclude them from the society. On the other hand, the percentage of unemployed men increased too. The economic pressure makes people angry, and they should deal with this problem inside families, it is not possible. So this leads to violence, divorce, and violent crimes at times committed against women. Third, in a complicated economic situation, people are not able to afford their children's education expenses. So sometimes they should decide which child should go to school and which one should stay at home. Usually they choose girls to stay at home, help parents, and raise the other children, and do domestic works. Also, these girls may be forced to marry some old men for financial benefit of family. So, what I'm trying to say here is that poverty, this poverty to which sanction is a major contributor, can have a profound impact on the situation of women in Iran. And it will end pushing back their social gains.
So, Parisa, my last question, she has one more question that I want her to talk about, is what do you think the international community can do in this situation?
We have some women's rights activists who came out of country for education and plan to go back their country and after they complete their studies. I think the international community should provide them the opportunity to learn about civil society and to improve their skills. There should be some programs targeting these women. At present, Iran is isolated and everyone just said, oh, well, we cannot work about Iran or we cannot work with Iran. Or they work with some groups inside of Iran who will be strengthened, but will never work for positive change and for women's rights. But these activists outside of Iran will go back and work for positive changes, or even if they are outside, they will work for women, they still work women's rights. So this is a way to strengthen civil society. Also, I know lots of activists who want to follow their education abroad, but they can't. In fact, because of the situation of Iran and the situation of Iranian government and sanctions, the international community restrict the possible opportunity for education and punish people, especially young people who can change the future of their country. I think we need to exchange our experience and help people inside of Iran to communicate with international community. I think that's, international community can do about this.
Thank you very much, Parisa.
Thank you.
So, Visaka, you're here, you're the founder and chair of the Association of War-Affected Women, and you're here in New York. Well, normally here in New York City at the United Nations, at the Security Council, the discussions are around security sector reform, peace and justice, reconciliation in post-conflict societies at the policy level. But you're doing the work at the grassroots level. So could you tell us about your experience and your lessons learned in the work you're doing in northern Sri Lanka? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really delighted to be here because, the policies that you make here in New York, it resonates for our day-to-day life, as our sisters from Middle East told very clearly. It's easy to have sanctions on countries, but finally, it's the people, who's going to really be affected, especially the people, the common people, because in any society, whether it is there in Iran or in Sri Lanka or here in the States, there is a class who does, who is responsible for these things, will be never affected by any of these sanctions. So, that's the reality. I thought I must say that because it was really echoing in my ears. So, to start with, before even I start about my country, especially in Sri Lanka, it's a post-war country. Sri Lanka is not a post-conflict because the root causes of the conflict is yet to be addressed by the government of Sri Lanka. We as women, we as especially also our parents of servicemen missing in action, we do advocate for a political arrangement where all our people, can be equal citizens, no matter what religion, what surname they carry. But as Sri Lankans, they have to live with dignity and with equality. So that's the basic, and we have a long way to go. It's also extremely important just not to forget countries who may be relatively, there's no armed conflict, because Sri Lanka is in a situation where we could walk into a much worse armed conflict if these issues are not addressed. So that's, I just want to remind you, and especially as women, we also are very much concerned about what's happening in our country, and also especially because the CSW, this year speaks about violence against women, Sri Lanka have experienced a significant increase on violence against women, whether it's violence on the streets or workplace or domestic. It's really also especially because of the fact that the governments, as you told in your countries, they think that this is a trivial issue. It's not threatening. It's not as you told, the hard issues or big issues that we have to have diplomacy with the other countries, or it's the geopolitical situations. But it's a trivial matter, what about women? But it's extremely important to understand that this, especially the violence against women, has a connection to democracy, to governance, and also economy of any given country. No country in the world can be developed or prosper if the women in the country is not treated well. We have examples. Per capita income in the world, who are the highest? The Scandinavians. From Alva Myrdal's time, the fight for equality. Now we see the results. It's extremely important. For us as women, it's extremely important to make this connection, the connection of economy and the violence, because sometimes it's only the money which makes people understand things. So it's important for us to really make this connection. And for us, we who have been working with the soldiers, so it was easy, and especially because of the fact that 10 districts of our country out of the 25 was directly affected by a 30-year-long bloody conflict. It's difficult, and I really don't want to go to bore you with what we have gone through. And we wanted to exactly see how best we could at least make a small difference in the lives of the women, especially where their security and safety is concerned. And we thought, why not to work with the police? After all, the police and the military are there, day-to-day life is there, and that's where they are stationed. And especially just after a 30-year-long war, especially the 10 districts that I'm speaking are heavily militarized. So we have maximum number of our military and also the police are stationed there. But of course, Sri Lanka is having a good practice of women's desks at the police station. This is something that from 1993 that Sri Lanka had. We have a special desk for women. There are definitely challenges of language and also staff, but technically we have 43 bureaus and a desk at all the police stations. So what we thought was we wanted to have workshops for the police and military. As well, we got the health sector involved because we thought, these are the sectors. Especially also we got the religious leaders involved because, after a 30-year-long war, the trust between the community and the law enforcement officials are really at a very low. So we needed the religious leaders to come in to bridge that gap. And we had these workshops and, we had the 4 pillars of the 1325 resolution, and we asked them, we told them, what is the biggest challenge that you as the police face? And what are your recommendations to put this right? And 99% of all these 10 districts, it was violence against women that the police saw as the biggest challenge after war that they are facing. And of course, they did come. I want to be brief, but I want to just tell the story. Because in one district, which is Kilinochchi, which is, I think, whoever is familiar with Sri Lanka, and especially the conflict, knows that Kilinochchi was the headquarters of the Liberation Tigers. And the police there, we asked them recommendations, and I can't remember whether they gave the recommendations at the workshop, but what they did was, we have a system of volunteer working. So they selected a village every week, and they went to the village and told that, we will voluntarily, all the community will come together and maybe clean the wells or clean the drains or whatever it is. And there they were speaking to the women and telling that if there's any issues, you can come to us. So this kind of building the trust. And I was really surprised when a UN high-level delegation visited Kilinochchi. The women told that there is a reduction of violence. I never made the connection of that to our workshop. Only when we had a regional workshop, the police, in fact, I couldn't help laughing. This police officer, who's a young person, came with a book with 4 pages written, and he said, I want 20 minutes, because I have this success story to tell. And those days we used to get 5, at least minimum 5 cases reported every day, but now it has reduced. So I want to stop at that and maybe answer questions later.
Thank you, Visaka. So now I turn to you, Mr. Minister, and I just want to ask your reactions, your comments, your thoughts on what you've heard, but also what is Norway doing in the region on these issues, and what do you think that the international community can do in the future? Thank you.
Do I have 3 hours? Well, first of all, it's been a privilege to sit here because these stories are very valuable and they've been told by such eloquent people. I think these are, the story that you tell from Sri Lanka is one that we need to keep in mind, because we can become, at least where I sit, we can become very theoretical about things, while in actual fact the way you change these power structures in society is through concrete action, like for example with the law enforcement personnel. And there is a very close link to what you did to what's going on in India now, where they, as a follow-up on the gang rape on the 16th of December last year, there's a big debate on how to sensitize the police and make them more able to understand the needs of women. But there is some use in theoretizing as well, and this is where I think Sanam's points were very valuable, and it reminded me of my first contact with feminist theory. I think I must have been 7 years old. And it was my dad he's a dentist, but he was a feminist. He is a feminist, and he was reading Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex from 1949, and we were discussing, I remember, the phrase which says, a woman is not born a woman, but becomes a woman. And I think it's such a and that was sort of the takeoff point for him to and the 7-year-old Arvinn to understand feminism. My point is really that there is no other academic discipline that has such a robust way of power analysis as feminism has. And I think we need to dig out the good old power analysis of theoretical feminism again when we discuss Middle East, North Africa, and also other post-conflict and conflict societies, because it is in these situations of violence where these structures are being most clearly exposed, and you have to tackle them head on. I also like to point about the Viagra paradox. I think I'm going to use that term. It really is a big paradox. I mean, how decision makers can be so two-faced about something as serious as what really is a moral judgment. And I think it really brings me to a question that I'd like you to reflect on, and that's as an outside actor, how do we relate to these paradoxes? I mean, it's not only that one; there are several others, because I mean, we try to work to build networks through women's organizations all over the world. But we also know, and this report as well, the ICAN report, very clearly states that there are problems with being outside actors and supporting women's networks, because it might erode the very legitimacy of the movement. And for us, that's a constant dilemma where I need guidance on what kind of questions do we need to ask to make sure that we don't shoot ourselves in the leg, or I shouldn't probably use that phrase, but do something to undermine the legitimacy of the movements that we want to strengthen. Let me just say as well, I mean, the issue of 1325 and how to include women in peace processes, I think it's something that we find a very exciting topic in Norway. And Norway is involved in a number of peace negotiations. Most of them are not publicly known, but there are several around the world. And we try to employ the 1325 and include women as much as we can, or at least encourage the parties in these negotiations to take women with them to the table. Which is not always easy. I think we've made some progress on the issue of Colombia, for example, but there are which is one of the ones that are publicly known. But it's not easy, because any peace negotiation is, and we don't. It's a fundamental principle for Norwegian engagement in these issues, and that is we will not go in, negotiate, or offer any assistance unless both or all three or all five parties accept and invite the mediator. So there is a challenge there, because the mediator or the negotiator doesn't really have the mandate in real peace negotiations to push for women's participation. But I just wanted to bring that up. And then was one last point, which is back to the theory. And that's to you, Sanam, again. I mean, you refer to the fact that you cannot have peace somewhere where 50% of the population is threatened. I think that's a key point, but I would really ask, can you call anything peace where 50% of the population is threatened? It's the whole definition of peace, which is, I think, terribly wrong in the way that we deal with it in the building behind, which is the cessation of armed violence, which is, I mean, it has something to do with peace and war and peace, but it doesn't definitely not have everything to do with war and peace. So to define a society where 50% of the population feels threatened as a peaceful society is nonsense to my mind. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that, because I could say a lot more, but I feel very humbled by these comments from practical activists and much better, well formulated speeches than I could ever deliver. But so I think I'll just say thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that. I think we've been able to frame our discussion here very, very well. I'm going to go ahead, if it's okay with the panel, and open it up to our audience for questions, because we will at the end make sure that everyone gets a chance to have some concluding remark. So I see over here, we'll go to the center. We'll kind of go across the room with this first round. Now, because of time, what I'm going to do is I am going to take a couple questions in groups. So please go ahead, introduce yourself, who you're with, and answer your question.
Okay, my name is Daniela Colombo. I'm the president of IDOS, the Italian Association for Women in Development. And we are a development NGO, and we work to give financial, organizational, technical support to local women's organizations. And we have worked a lot in the Middle East, Egypt, Gaza, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria. We're still in Jordan and Syria. Right now, we worked in Iran, and we started working in Pakistan and then in Afghanistan. So we have a lot of experience. I have a question for Dr. Sabat, and just a comment on what you said. Okay, one question is, you mentioned religious leaders. I would like to know which religions are you mentioning? Because I remember from working in Lebanon, it was many years ago, that there were 16 family laws according to the various religious and groups. So I would like to know exactly which religions come in and say you shouldn't have this piece of law because it's against our religion. The other thing, I agree with you that women issues are political issues and they should be brought into the political discussion, bilateral, multilateral discussions. But being, development, I'm a development economist, and I don't know what I am now because I've been dealing for 40 years now with many issues, dealing with women in development and gender issues. I would go a bit further for the international community. Let's face it, I'm talking from the European side. I'm Italian, and we have seen, the Egyptian leaders, the Libyan leaders, the Tunisian leaders coming to Rome and ask for development funding. And they have been going around, I think, asking all countries. So our position was, and this was suggested by the women of the region, by the feminists and the women's rights groups we worked with, that we should ask our government to put conditionalities on our aid. We won't give you any aid if you keep on offending, not pursuing women's rights. This was done in Afghanistan. Why can't it be done for the Middle East? Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to take, I think there was a question in the middle here, and then I'm going to come up here to the front row, and I'll come back for another round. The middle, right there in the middle. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, she's got her.
Hi, I'm Parinion Nazari, and I'm a program associate at the Social Sciences Research Council, but I'm from Afghanistan and a feminist at heart. So I have a few questions and comments. Sorry, I will say it. First, from Sanam. First, I want to thank you all for this really great panel. On the international involvement, when you say that there are agendas that support women's rights in the Middle East, but there are also some sanctions that promote abuse of women's rights that the international community sometimes approves. I wonder if you could give a few examples of that, and if Afghanistan's peace process currently could be a very obvious example of that, and how that can improve.
Could we ask you to just maybe have two questions so we can give other people a chance as well? Okay?
Of course.
Thank you.
And then on just in general about religion, I think that be it Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, when we look at it, it has it's never in favor of women in many ways. I wonder if you agree with that. And when Dr. Sabat said about the civil marriage that took place in Lebanon, if there could be a movement of laws for women in general, from religious into secular laws, and how that can be, if that can help women's rights in general in the Middle East and South Asia and in Islamic countries in general. Thank you.
Okay, so and the third question we'll take is here in the front, please. Thank you.
Okay. Razan Naim El-Mughrabi from Libya, writer and journalist. Okay, I will talk in Arabic and Madeline translation for me. سوف أتحدث عن ليبيا اليوم، ماذا يحدث وبالأمس. اعتداءات أولا على الشرعية، المؤتمر الوطني، وعلى الأعضاء من قبل ميليشيات مسلحة. اليوم تم الاعتداء على قناة العاصمة وخطف كل العاملين فيها. الواقع أخي أيضا كان بين العاملين، تم تهديدهم والتفاوض معهم وعلى أن يسلموا الفيديو الذي تم تسجيله حول الاعتداء، ثم تم التفاوض معهم على أن يرحلوا من طرابلس. قبل قليل كنت أتابع أن هذه الاعتداءات ازدادت. في المرات الماضية تم خطف كثير من الإعلاميين ومن الصحفيين وتهديدهم، بما فيهم أنا كنت مهددة بالقتل لأكثر من مرة، أكثر من 3 مرات. هذه الاعتداءات من قبل الميليشيات لم نجد لها حل. الدولة حتى الآن لم تستقر ولم تضع أي حل. أريد أن أعرف دور المنظمات الدولية ومنظمة العفو Human Rights، أي منظمة في هذا المجال.
She's describing to you something that she learned about that happened yesterday. There were protests in Tripoli of women against the armed militias. And one of the liberal channels, El Asima, which means the capital, covered the protests. And the militias took revenge against them and threatened and kidnapped the entire team that covered them and took the video of the protest and everything. And she's saying that this is a trend, that the militias are kidnapping people and threatening people, and that has happened before to journalists, and she herself has been threatened, and her life has been threatened. And she wants to know
دور المنظمات يعني في الحماية، يعني ماذا تفعل المنظمات من أجل الإعلاميين؟
She wants to know the role that we can play and that the organizations can play in remedying the situation in which a lot of people are threatened, including feminists like herself and writers, but also the media.
Okay, so I think with this first round of questions, I think maybe we'll turn to you, Rita first, Sanam, and then Mr. Minister, maybe you could talk about the conditionality issue. Thank you.
I purposely didn't mention which religion, because obviously very familiar with Lebanon. There are 18 recognized confessions in Lebanon by the state, and up to 15 laws, the confessional personal status laws, and they all differ. The objections at one point or another, they come from different communities. So maybe in these recent, they came from, say, Dar al-Fatwa. But previously, say, when the Harawi proposal for civil marriage law was proposed in the 90s, and communities were ready to negotiate and pass the civil marriage law, the religious leaders went to the politicians and said, okay, if you want to, discuss a civil marriage law, let's discuss proportional representation again. And then once again, they were like, okay, well, politicians, given the choice between their rights at the political party and their presence at the table and their religion, will always back. And that's the main argument, is that these personal status, it's the religion is not the problem. It's the tie between these personal tie between these personal status codes and the politics of the country that is threatening unity, that is usually proportional representation in successful cases is about bringing national unity. And in cases like Lebanon, I think it's been known and discussed as a failure, because it has created what we consider more and more sectarianism, and more actually embeddedness in these separate communities that are holding on to their identity and really they've lost their identity because they cannot even relate to their partners that they used to live by day years ago. I mean, and that was the point, is that addressing the issue of women inequality addresses a slew of issues, from development to equality to rights, and then to peace. I mean, negative peace or positive peace, the argument. I mean, at some point we have to, I mean, when we talk about peace, we talk about positive peace as a utopian, eventuality that we might never get to. But all societies live with peace, which means at least no killing, and systems that can protect us and have us ride our cars at night and feel safe and feel amongst each other as a family. So I think that's my question, and I don't think, regardless, which answers the second question about, is religion, I mean, contradictory to women's rights? I think the interpretation of religion is contradictory to women's rights in all religions. It's who is actually looking at, because religion at the core it does not, I mean, there are ways you can look and say, okay, here in this religion, in this verse, it's actually preaching for respect and healthy relationships. And then someone can take another verse and use a very contradictory. So I think that engagement with religious leaders is actually an important step as well. And I think we have done that on the ground. Abad, in its last campaign, 16 days of activism to eliminate violence against women, had a campaign called We Believe. This campaign was on posters and on TV stations, and they went to every single religious leader in Lebanon, across all confessions, and had religious leaders on TV saying that violence against women is against our religion and that we refuse it. That is a powerful statement coming from religious leaders. Now, what do we do with that statement is what's important. How do we take that statement and hold them accountable to those words and have them not oppose laws and have them negotiate with us? That would be the good success. And conditionalities, I have a problem with conditionalities, especially at the development level, because we have not seen success. Conditionalities, as in I was talking at the foreign policy level, with imposing upon leaders not to negotiate. That's, I mean, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Rita. I think, Sanam, some of the questions were addressed to you.
Sure. Afghanistan, I think, is another example where we see this sort of schizophrenia of on the one hand saying we have a national action plan, we think women's rights, and then off we go and we do something. Actually, in most places we're seeing this. So the national action plan is a plan. It's not really action in any transformative way. But the example, I think, from Afghanistan, which is very stark, is that when they were looking at the security, indicators of security for the transition period, there is not one single, this is NATO and everybody else, who all have women, peace and security action plans, by the way, not one single one of the indicators was about women's security. Right? And what we've been doing, including the US government, is we've been supporting having supposed Talibans and these various militia groups, some of them are, God knows what they are, demobilized, right? Being given very minimal supposed training, rearmed and sent back into communities, and guess what? Rapes and so forth are going up. And where is the space to talk about this? Where are the spaces to engage? So we need to be honest about this. Is the piece of the women, peace and security agenda is a very serious transformative agenda. It's not just the ladies having tea and now wanting to talk about nice things. It's about putting our finger on some very serious issues. And I think that those of us who work internationally will keep doing that, and because our partners on the ground are saying this. In terms of going back to somebody, are we going to call it the Viagra paradox now? Is that how it's going? My experience is that very often the labels get in the way. So if we say women's rights and it's been somehow understood as you want our women to have promiscuity, of course there's a lot of resistance. However, if we take away the label and we say, okay, do you think your daughter should have the right to get out of a marriage when she's being beaten up, for example, or the right to health care, or somehow break it down issue by issue to then see where the problems are. There will be points of contention, there's no doubt. But let's look at some of those things. I remember a few years ago at one of the Oslo Forum meetings, there were some Taliban representatives. And the conversation was up here. If somebody's talking about peace process, these guys were saying we're tired of war. And in the discussions, I was just really curious. I said, what do you want for your daughters and sons in 10 years' time in your country, on the ground? And all of a sudden, their eyes lit up, and they said, we want them to have dignified lives, we want them to have clean water, we want them to go to school, we want them to have comfortable lives. It's like, that's a starting point for a conversation. And then we got into a discussion around why did they say they wanted an Islamic state? And because they equated secularism with corruption, with being a-religious. So the term secular is misunderstood in all sorts of ways, and we're seeing that in the region. So we have to be really careful about the labels, what we understand and how they're understood. And I'll give you a very funny example. The term gender mainstreaming, which is this dreadful, dreadful UN jargon out there. In Cambodia, in a workshop, it was being translated, and every time they said gender mainstreaming and it was translated into Khmer, people would start laughing. So finally, the trainer said, what's going on? And it was translated as men and women, gender, streaming, jumping into the river together. Okay? So just take that away with you. Okay? I mean, the issues, there are some very serious issues, but let's not let our labeling get in the way of actually getting some practical work done. And then finally, get the women themselves to ask for it. I don't think that when I go somewhere, I can advocate, but it's much more effective if I open the space and bring in the women to do the speaking for themselves. When we say inclusivity, that's what we're saying. Put them at the table. We've seen Somali women do it. We've seen Afghan women do it. Everywhere we go, if we allow the women to have that same equal space, they will get over this paradox that we're talking about. So our job is to facilitate, I think.
So, Mr. Minister, over to you on any comments or answers you want to give.
The very simple question of conditionality. I think, it is a very important question, but it doesn't. I don't think I can give you a very clear answer to it. First of all, we need to clarify whether we're talking about conditionality of all aid or aid that goes to government structures. I am much more ready to talk about conditionalities when it goes to government structures than the rest of the aid. In a sense, it is the same debate as sanctions, because in principle it is, because if you put the condition on countries, on state-to-state aid, then you might worsen things. Now, that's why I would advocate for a case-by-case way of doing it. What we are going to do in our development policy is to put a lot more emphasis on democratic development, trying to find indicators of how countries are developing democratically, and by those indicators decide whether we're going to support them. So that will change the way that we do business in the future. But I spent half my short life advocating to throw conditionality out the window, and now suddenly I talk in order to get conditionality in again. So I find it quite difficult, to be honest. And it's one answer that seems right that might not be right in every situation.
So we're going to take another series. I had a question from the gentleman. Do you still have a question or no? Yes? Here, and then I'm going to take this gentleman in the front and the woman there. So we'll take that threesome. We'll add you on the fourth, okay, as a fourth person. So go ahead.
Howard Mollett with Care International. Thank you for fascinating presentations and discussions so far. We're doing research at the moment in the Middle East and North Africa region on implications of the popular uprisings for our work and how we can be more relevant and address some of these issues you've highlighted. I wondered if some of the panelists could elaborate on some of the challenges, either good practices or not so good practices, in engaging with institutions or individuals that may not be, sort of dig a bit further into this Viagra paradox, if you like. Talking to one Arab feminist scholar in Cairo a week ago, she sort of highlighted maybe there are three categories. There's for a secular rights-based NGO, there's the basic level of cultural sensitivity in explaining, as we do, whether it's a maternal health program or education, that this can be consistent with religious principles. Then there are some of our partners that are explicitly faith-based and have a progressive agenda to sort of talk about how gender equality and equality is, for instance, perhaps a primary value within scripture for some religions, and rather than difference between the sexes. And then there was this sort of more murky third category of where development actors or external actors maybe engage with religious institutions, but then it's sort of not really knowing whether the tail's wagging the dog or what you're trying to achieve through that partnership or collaboration gets lost, and things get, and that one's a harder category to define and understand. Just wondering if you have any more examples of any of those, or perhaps other approaches and issues. Thank you.
Okay, so we have the gentleman here in the front who had a question.
Hi, my name is Sia. I'm from Scan News. Part of my question is to do with these two strong ladies from Iran, and the rest, whoever wants to answer from the panel. There was a documentary recently in Iran in regard of a single lady was driving a city bus, and it shows the problems she was facing every day and raising a son. And when they were asking questions about the son turned and to the camera and said that, a woman has to stay at home. I'm going to educate myself and get money, so my mom should stay at home and doesn't work. How do you change a mentality like that in Iran? The other question to the panel is, you guys always talk about international help, international community. Who are these secret international communities? If you're talking about across the street, these are the ones who create problems to start with. So who are the international communities that you guys are talking about? Thank you.
Okay, and the third question was this right over here in the front. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Camelia Mortazadeh. I work for the policy division in the New York City Health Department, but Iranian by background. And my question is two parts. One is, what are the efforts to sort of quantify, gender inequality, aside from it being a good thing to do? But I think, so what we try to always figure out a way to make the case, the business case for why you shouldn't have sort of health disparities, and what are the things that are being done to sort of sell that in some way, shape, or form? Because that, to me, sometimes does speak to people. And the other question is sort of more practically, like sort of what, this could be broad or more sort of on the ground level, but what are the things that men can do? What are the things that we can ask of men, and, just interpersonally or, through a policy structural level, to sort of get them to care about gender equality and women's rights? Thank you.
Okay, so we said we'd take a fourth question over here from Suzanne.
Thank you. I'm Susanne Tahmasabi, and I'm also a co-founder of ICAN. So thank you very much, IPI and Norway, for co-hosting this very important event and giving us a chance to present the findings from this great forum that we had. I have a comment and then a specific question. And my comment really takes us back to what Trezan said, because I don't want what she said to be forgotten by this room, because this is the stark reality of what people are facing in this region and have been facing for a long time. It's just gotten so much worse because there's conflict, there's transition, the systems that were in place before are not working. And so I think it's critical to come back to her comment and frame it maybe in a broader sense, is that human rights defenders are under attack in this region. They're under attack even more so if they're women, and they're women human rights defenders. And we have this case of the Shukri Bel Aid in Tunisia, who was just assassinated. There's a list, it's been floating around since the beginning of the revolution, with no impunity, I think. these threats are being made and being carried out. Some of our partners in Tunisia and in Libya are on lists. They have been threatened. They've been threatened with violent action. And I think that, we have resolutions to protect human rights defenders and specifically women human rights defenders. And I just want to remind everybody in that room, and if you go back across the street, remind that again, because this is specific language that is in this final resolution and shouldn't be excluded. But there needs to be support for women human rights defenders and for movements, women's movements who are also under attack, who are being asked to step up and do the kind of work that perhaps they've never had the opportunity to do in this time of conflict and transition. They come from closed political space, and now they have to engage in all sorts of different kinds of works, and they're also under attack. Just kind of a reminder. And Razan has received personal threats. Her brother was kidnapped yesterday. So this is very significant development. And then my other question is not so unrelated to my comment, is how does civil society work? And it's really to Visaka and then to Parisa specifically. How does civil society work, manage to stay alive in a very oppressive environment, in very closed political space? And perhaps Visaka could talk just slightly, give us a sense of what it's like to be civil society in Sri Lanka, which is a very difficult space to work in. And Parisa can talk about the negative impact of sanctions on civil society right now. What are sanctions doing to civil society?
Okay, so we've got a lot of ground to cover, and so what I thought I would do, and I'm glad you asked a question for Visaka, because I'd like to start with Visaka. I thought maybe you could comment about working with men, and as well as answer that question, and then I'm going to go across the table here.
Working with men, unless otherwise you work with men, you're not going to head anywhere, because you'll be stuck. Because, like in Sri Lanka, we have a place where we protest, we call the Lipton Circus. So you could go there maybe for the whole life. Nothing will change unless otherwise you really speak and make the men understand and have them with you. And more, it's really nice because more and more we see young people, like we saw it in Delhi. More and more young men come because after all, who are they? They are our sons, our fathers, our brothers. So it's extremely important for us to really look at that. And having said that, I also want to tell the difficult states, yes. I was speaking with Sanam this afternoon because it's extremely important for us to engage with the difficult governments. Because unless otherwise we engage with them, again, we can't change things. Because, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, these countries are with us always. But we have to speak with those who are not with us. And that's what is peace building, after all. We went to speak with the Liberation Tigers. So you can't exclude anyone. We have to have everybody. And because of the time, I also want to tell that, defining security is extremely important for women to define security. And for me, it is like you have to make the enemy secure so that there will not be an enemy anymore. Because, all these guns all have never taken us anywhere. We have more trouble now because the technology is such that even without a man behind, you can kill thousands. And that have not taken us anywhere. So it is for us to make everybody secure. Thank you.
Okay, Rita, are there any questions you wanted to answer?
I was just going to address the challenges or approaches, good practices to civil society, because I think that's one of the major problems. One of the major problems I found initially when I went to do my dissertation in Lebanon. I was going to investigate the interreligious dialogue between women's organizations and to see how they came together to actually fight for a women's rights agenda. That was non-existent. It just wasn't there. There was nothing going on there because in Lebanon we use two words, مجتمع المدني ومجتمع الأهلي, for civil society. And there are these NGOs, which I call them like the third sector NGOs, and they've been working really hard and for a very long time, but they're really, filled with people that have had access to this space and to funding and tied to, because the survival of these NGOs are tied to international donors. So they exist because of that, but they don't access, one of the main challenges is them accessing the masses and actually getting a broad. So it's ironic. I was talking with another researcher in the field, and she was saying it's amazing. We call that when there were problems on the streets in Lebanon, the Permanent Peace Movement was calling for people to go on the streets and say, no, we don't want violence and we don't want to go back into a civil war. And they were going to a very sensitive area in Beirut. I think 20 showed up with their little signs and no to war and no, right? But then when faith-based communities or religious leaders call on people and say, come down, or even political parties, come down, and which is part, political parties are part of civil society, right? Come down to the streets, you can get thousands mobilized. It's a challenge. Definitely good practices. We haven't found any yet, but hopefully we will.
Mr. Minister?
Thank you. Very good questions. The challenge of, I actually think, was it Howard? I think you piled a lot of challenges into one challenge, but if I'm going to pick one of them, it is how do we meaningfully engage religious institutions or institutions with a religious background and I think there's no short answer to this, and it's my favorite English word is specificity. I worked quite a bit or had a lot of contact with church-based organizations in Southern Africa, and who works to further women's rights and also LGBTI rights. The only thing that works is a very long-term commitment. I think that's the only commonality among best practice stories is a long-term commitment. And locally based, what's in this report called as indigenous organizations need to be the ones that are heading this. But this is old common knowledge in development field now. But so I don't have any other answer to you for that. Who is the international community? Great question. I like this one. There's no simple answer. But what's happening in the Middle East is, arguably the powers that have the most influence on what's going on in the Middle East are not what we Western countries normally talk about as the international community. I'm not going to name names, but there are many countries that not necessarily contribute to international consensus on progressive rights issues. It's difficult to define international community. It depends on what kind of situation you're in. But in Lebanon, I think every person you ask on the street in Lebanon will have a different definition and add a different color to it, positive or negative. So I'm answering all the questions with no answer. I'm a politician after all. The business case for women equality, I think it's a very good question. But let me just start with saying that let's be a little bit careful, because I feel right now that the way we talk about women equality is that we want women equality not as an end as it in itself, but because it gains, society gains from it. Which is of course true, but I feel, when the World Bank makes a report about women equality, all they care about is whether or not it gains, the economy gains from it. We need to be able to properly, keep. The first thing we should talk about is the moral issue on this and the rights issue, which is not. It's not a business case. It's a rights issue. But then there is the business case, and I normally, when I talk about this, I mention how in Norway, how if you add up all the oil that we have. Or let's start at the other end. We have about 76 or 77% participation rate of women in work life. And if you add up all our oil revenue, past, present, and predicted future, it comes short of the value added to the economy by women's participation in work life. So that's, I mean, I think it's a good way of visualizing it. I mean, we are the 4th or 5th largest oil exporter in the world. Then what can men do? Then I actually want to use this opportunity to point to one man in the audience. And Fredrik, there he is. He's Norway's women's ambassador. He heads all our efforts on fighting for women's rights all over the world in all our development programs. He has a great and very dedicated team with him. We also work directly with male-driven organizations, and they exist, and they do excellent work. So I think let's try to find these organizations and let them themselves define how they can change the course of history. And then the shrinking space for civil society. This is a very serious issue, and it's not only in the Middle East, or it's all over the world. It's really worrying. The analysis is different from in each country, but it is a fact that the space for civil society is dramatically shrinking, and this is in an age where if you are a dictator and you want to take over the United States of America tomorrow, the first thing you will do as a dictator is to arrange an election. Democracy has become the value to strive for. So any dictator will always arrange an election. And even with this development where the only right way of governing is through democracy, we see a shrinking of civil society space. There is something seriously wrong. I don't have the remedy, just an analysis. Thank you.
Okay, Sanam?
Just quickly on the answer to the little boy and the bus driver. I think Iran, despite what we've said to you, I mean, part of the problem is that Iran is incredibly socially progressive. Our men have really come leaps and bounds in terms of the younger generation and so forth. And I always worry about taking one little example of somebody, some little boy, and sort of elevating that to the point of this is what's going on. The problem is how are we going backwards? And I'll give you Iraq. Iraq in 1979 didn't have illiteracy problems. They were a fully literate society. Comes war, sanctions, they have now 40% of their women are illiterate. Okay, so they're next door to Iran, and that's what we're worried about. That's what we don't want to go down that road, because that's an enormous hill to climb up again. So that's one thing. In terms of our colleague from Libya, what I'm struck by is that Libya was all the rage. It was the fashion of 2011, and now it's Syria or sequester or whatever it is in our media here. And we need to look back at what's going on in Libya. We need to understand who are these militias, what's their issues, and where are they getting support from. Sometimes I think that maybe this is the paradox of, with friends like this, frankly, what are we doing in the region? Because as you know, the rest of the statement, but it's, what role can those outside players play in maybe pressuring some of these militias? Who are these young men? Actually, going back to the question of men, one of the things that I found in my work is that if we start doing proper gendered analysis of crisis situations, what you'll find is that the vast majority of vulnerable people, women and men, are not benefiting at all from all the development aid we pour into these countries. So you have to say, what on earth have we been doing all this time? And the young men are the ones who are most vulnerable to being recruited into violence, being coerced into violence, or being forced into it because that's the way that they might make some money or whatever. So we need to really refocus on Libya and figure out what on earth have we done, because we did, it's gone. It's where's the disarmament programming? Where's the attention? Where's all of these things? And I think what you're saying, just again, it's about time to try and bring back. And then finally, UN membership comes with responsibility, doesn't it? I mean, the UDHR, the Charter, we the people. I mean, I really think we need to go back to basics. Everyone's talking about post 2015 agenda. I'm like, did we do the MDGs to now talk about 2015? Did we do UDHR? Can we not go back to the basic elements and say, if you're going to be a member state, that we will hold each other each other accountable. Yes, we can point to our Western colleagues and say, you guys are doing bad stuff, as well as to the other cases. And finally, the Vatican. Let's please look at what the Vatican is doing, because we look at these countries and say it's the Islamic states, but it's the Vatican who's really doing some very insidious work around women's rights and pulling together other religious radical groups. And this is very dangerous for the future of the international normative system that we have. And I think that we need to understand that and look at the other side of it, which is women in our region. And I'll end with this. When we had our meeting, it was when the embassies were being attacked. And our Libyan colleagues, in fact, said first the radical extremists came and they attacked the dead, the shrines, as we've seen. And then they attacked the vulnerable, which is the women, and now they attacked the Americans. And of course, the American media only picked up on that piece of it. At the same meeting, that evening we took them out and we put some music on, and women being women started dancing. And I was looking around and I was like, Syria is dancing with Afghanistan, that's dancing with Yemen, which is dancing with Iran. Our Saudi colleagues couldn't be there. But that's one vision of our region. Incredibly plural, incredibly tolerant, incredibly wanting a future that's full of life and opportunity for everybody. And then there's this other side that's getting so much of the attention. And I, which side do you want to be on? Because I think it's very clear, and I certainly go with the life-affirming voices, and that's why I think we need the women front and center in the discussions around our region right now. They should be everywhere in every development conversation, in every friends of this country and that country, in every security discourse. We need the women there. They have not only the answer, but the commitments, I think. So let's look at that and make sure that we do it with Syria and Libya, for sure. Thank you.
So, Parisa, I think there were two questions directed at you. Thank you.
About your question, as I mentioned before, Iran has a male-dominated culture, and changing this culture takes time, like some other changes. Women's activists have done lots of work on these subjects. For example, 1 million campaign against discrimination laws against women. They provided, women's activists, they provided some notebooks about women's rights. They designed websites, wrote many articles, and did many interviews, and went to the street and talked to people face to face. And also they held workshops about women's rights, for raising society awareness. And I think what you saw in 2009 was the result of actually these activities that different social and political groups inside of Iran had done before this green movement. So I think it takes time, and we should see what happens in the future. It takes time, many times. And about your question, Susan, as you know, part of activists left Iran, and some others are in prison. But still, some young people are joined to the different groups because they believe in change, because they believe that change will happen from inside of the country, and they are not waiting for war or for helping some other countries, helping them to change everything inside of the country. They do know that everything can be changed by their choice and their activities. But they do some political activities and write some articles and try to raise awareness, society awareness, and also they try to talk to authorities and about everything. But sanction on one hand and the government on the other hand paralyzes them. They have to work so hard for their basic needs. Also, as I told you before, sanction is pushing back their social gains. They have to work for everything again and again. And I think democracy cannot happen in a society in where people cannot afford their basic needs and cannot educate. So I don't know what other choice have Iranian civil society and what they can do in this condition that they feel this much pressure from government and international society. Really, I don't know what they can do at this situation.
Thank you. Now I'm going to stick with what my plan was, and that was to give everyone on the panel like a 1-minute final message that they want to say. And in preparing for the panel, one of the things we talked about is we knew that tonight we would talk a lot about the problems and the challenges. And we wanted to make sure we had a moment of wrap-up to focus a little bit, you know, as State Secretary Gadgil was saying, I should end by promoting the report because it has very practical suggestions and thoughts that take sometimes, I think some of the discussion here, it goes very deep, but then this report it's very accessible, whether you're at the policy level, I think, or at the grassroots level. But I do want to give all of the panelists the chance to have this one final word that they want to share, and then we have this time for networking. And in doing that, though, I'm going to go in reverse order from our speakers. So the first one for any final thoughts, and if you don't, that's fine. You can have time to more time with the audience. So, Minister, I start with you.
I'm going to be very out of line and end with a joke. There's an island outside in Norway in the Atlantic Ocean called Jan Mayen. When you travel to that island, there's only one thing there, and that's a weather station. On that weather station, there is a bronze plaque, and it says, theory is when nothing works, but everyone understands why. Practice is when everything works, but nobody understands why. At this station, we combine theory and practice, so nothing works and nobody understands why. I started to talk a little bit about theory and a little bit about practice. This is a major challenge in this battle, is to join the two and not forget one while doing the other. I think that's a challenge for the modern women's and men's movements against violence against women, is to not, throw away the theoretical baggage that we have and lessons that we've learned, but really integrate them and find out what is it that works. And let's find the men in this. I think it's a key point, and trust them, because there is that hasn't been the proudest moments of feminist history. When it comes to trust, you need to trust men and their ability and wish to change the patriarchal, terrible structure that they are trapped in. Thank you.
Okay, so Visaka, last word.
Yeah, very briefly. What I want to say is, we definitely have to walk the journey together with women and men. You can't have one hand to clap. So you need to walk this journey together. And I am very hopeful that we could do that, because we have come a long way. Thank you.
Parisa, any last word?
Yes. We are women's rights activists, or at least we care about women's rights that we are here at this moment. I want you to remember that sanction is against women's rights and human rights. And I'm just a voice from Iran, and I ask, please consider this problem as one of international problems and work against this, because we have lots of problems inside the country. We are losing people, we are losing children, and this is not human rights. We can sit here behind this desk, we can speak and speak and speak about human rights and women's rights, but still people inside of the countries like Iran are dying because of West policies and sanctions. Please consider this. Thank you.
Thank you. Rita, final words.
I'm going to be very, very brief and kind of far away from where I was with you, but I want the international community to consider its role in the region, the implications of its role, and the fact that if we look at the question of disarmament, if we look at the question of weapons flows and governance and future governments, these must be addressed with a gendered analysis of that. And I use the term gender as not just women's rights. It's about the societies and men and women in our societies and the implications of bringing in transitional governments, supporting transitional governments, and their effects on the people that actually began these revolutions and said, we have a problem.
Sanam.
I was just going to thank everybody, but I wanted to put this question to us, that we really need to move from the systems and the way we work from the 20th century to the 21st century. Where do we want to be in 10 years' time with our region? With all the weapons and all the radicalism, where is, and it's not just our region, I think we're seeing it everywhere, whether it's in Latin America or in Africa. I think it's time for us to, as an international community, to start thinking about that vision and how do we need to go from here to there, because at the moment it is the worst forces. It is the arms trade and the radical forces that are just pushing ahead. They have a vision and our side doesn't. We've lost the narrative, we've lost the plot. We keep trying to cobble it together, but maybe it's time for us to revisit and rethink. And I think what you'll find is that human security is the thing that binds us all together. Human security, human rights, and human dignity binds us all together very strongly. So maybe that's one of the things to redirect this big institution here, which is meant to represent all of us, into the 21st century, as opposed to trying to prevent the kinds of wars that, it was designed for the old wars. These are new wars. And wars, I mean it in a large sense. So that might be one way of trying to think about it big. But coming down to the practice level, we see the practice on the ground with our colleagues all the time. They are there, regardless of whether we know or not, they are there. And I would also like us to shine more of a light on constructive, nonviolent actors and give them the legitimacy and the recognition that they really deserve. At the moment, if you have a gun and you're very violent, we recognize you. That's not a very good answer for women, because otherwise we'd all have to get armed, and we don't really want to do that. But I really do think that the practice is on the ground. We just need to put on our lenses and look at it more. Thank you.
So I really want to thank everyone, our panelists, our audience, and this is the opportunity now. Please stay. This is a networking opportunity. And speak informally with our panelists. So thank you all very much for coming tonight.